Moving first in a market does not necessarily create advantage. In fact, moving first in a market without the ability to create barriers to entry creates first mover disadvantage. Why? Because if a company moves first into a market without the ability to create barriers to entry, they just signal this opportunity to everybody else, including much larger, better funded companies who can then dominate that space. So the key to success in being a first mover is to be able to capture the value of the market in the first exponential growth phase. And historically, it's the case that most of the time, the first mover in a particular market is not the company that captures the value of the market in the exponential growth phase. Example, who was the first company to launch a home personal computer? You might think it's IBM, you might think it's Apple, you might think it's Hewlett-Packard. It's none of these companies. The first company to launch a home personal computer was Altair. And I guarantee none of you or very few of you have ever heard of Altair. Why have you never heard of Altair? Because they were a first mover. And now they are only existing in the historical graveyard of failed first movers. How about spreadsheet software, computer spreadsheet software? Who was the first mover in computer spreadsheet software? You probably think, you might guess Microsoft. It's not correct. You might guess Lotus if you are around long enough. Both are not correct. The first mover in computer spreadsheet software was VisiCalc. Again, VisiCalc, I'm sure only the computer scientists or the people my age that remember VisiCalc have any notion that VisiCalc was a first mover. Again, failed first mover. Now, if we look at the first two examples, who was the last mover in personal computer, home personal computer, meaning who was the company that benefited most during the exponential growth phase was IBM. In computer spreadsheet software, Microsoft with Excel. Let's look at a third category, a third product category, PC operating systems. Who was the first mover in PC operating systems? In this case, you might guess Microsoft, and you would be correct. Microsoft with DOS was one of the, or arguably the first mover in PC operating system. And who is the last mover in PC operating systems? Also Microsoft. Microsoft still dominates PC operating systems even today, 40 years after the first PC operating systems reached the market. So why are these three categories different? Or what makes these three categories different? Why is it that the first mover in personal computer hardware failed to capture the bulk of the market during exponential growth phase? And same thing in PC spreadsheet software. But in PC operating systems, the first mover was able to also be the last mover. So what's the difference? The difference is the ability to create last mover advantage. In PC hardware and PC spreadsheet software, the first movers did not have an ability to create barriers to entry for followers and therefore could not move from that first mover position to that last mover position. But in PC operating systems, Microsoft was able to do that. Why? Because the PC operating system market is characterized by something called network externalities, or includes network externalities. What does that mean? This means that the actions of one player in the market affect the actions of another player in the market in a way that benefits the company who's moving first in this market. Now, how does that work? Well, let's look at the example of PC operating systems. Imagine that you are looking to buy a PC back in the early to mid 1980s when DOS was establishing itself as the first mover and ultimately last mover in PC operating systems. So imagine a landscape, what the landscape looked like back then for computer buyers. There were many different types of computers, and each one had a different type of operating system. So how would you choose which operating system to buy? You would choose an operating system on the basis of how much compatible software was available for that operating system. Now, imagine you are a software developer also developing software in the same market. So there are many incompatible operating systems, and you're looking to develop software, and you have to decide which operating system should I develop my software to run on. So as a software developer, you would choose to develop your software for the operating system that had the most buyers. For an operating system buyer, you would choose to buy the operating system for which there existed the most software. And you can see how this dynamic can very quickly create an evolutionary spiral where the operating system that first establishes a slight lead in the amount of software, compatible software available for it, drives out all other operating systems relatively quickly. Because why? As soon as one operating system establishes a slight lead, all software developers develop software for that operating system, which further increases that lead, which causes more software developers to develop software for that system. And that's how, there are other reasons too, but this is a fundamental reason why DOS and Microsoft were able to establish themselves as the leaders in the exponential growth phase of personal computing and maintain that, that last mover advantage through many years of growth in PC operating system market. Ironically, Apple, who was one of the very early movers in personal computers but didn't dominate the space during the early exponential growth phase because they were unable to create barriers to entry on the hardware side, employed a very similar strategy when they moved into smartphones. Why did iPhone, who was not the first mover, but a very early mover in smartphone market, also become the last mover during the first exponential growth phase of that market? Because they launched iPhone with App Store. So you can see the exact same dynamic at work. Other companies, first movers in smartphones like Nokia had released smartphones before, but without App Store. And therefore, they didn't benefit from this network externality effect that iPhone did benefit from. How did that work? When you bought your first iPhone and you realized you could download apps from the App Store, you realized, that's why I want a smartphone. I want a smartphone so I can download apps. And app developers saw iPhone selling a lot of units and therefore developed more apps. And this created a condition where Apple, who had never released a phone product before, very quickly became the successful first mover and for several years the last mover in the smartphone space. So if we generalize from what we talked about so far, strategies for first movers to create last mover advantage, create barriers to entry with strategy, and if possible, create barriers to entry with IP, intellectual property. So patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. Patents cover inventions, copyrights cover works, trademarks cover marks used in trade, and trade secrets are proprietary intellectual property that companies protect by keeping secret. So a very effective strategy to go from successful first mover to successful last mover is for the company to create barriers to entry to competitors with both IP strategy and competitive strategies that enable them to build barriers to entry.